welcome, and today I want to talk about horror, which I think I've talked about in the tier listing videos quite a bit because I dive into each of the games in depth a little more, but I kind of want to focus on the overarching what makes a horror game good, what makes it terrible, and what in general can horror games do to better themselves, or like a small checklist of, hey, did I do this right? Right, because a lot of horror games, they're different. Like, you have some that are set in houses, you have some that are set in forests, you have some that use the mic, you have some that use your camera, you have some that do neither but are still very frightening. I'm not saying you have to use a camera and a microphone to be a scary horror game. I think it makes horror games stand out nowadays because we have such an oversaturated genre. But that's not what makes horror games good, right? I have a small list, and I kind of want to just talk through them and kind of go over it. So, what makes a good horror game? Any horror game. Generalizations. Atmosphere. Lighting. Monsters. I'm gonna just throw every kind of creature or ghost or person or whatever in monster category. World building and connections. So why why So the first thing I want to touch on is atmosphere and lighting. I've put them separately because they are separate. Lighting is a big part of atmosphere, but it does not make atmosphere. Atmosphere has lighting, but it is not lighting. And I think that's where some horror games and even maybe horror movies, I don't know, I haven't seen many of them, but where horror games kind of get uh iffy in the "are we good" category, because a lot of horror games, or at least some of the ones that I've seen that are labeled as okay or bad, is the ones that take the lighting. And I know that there's wow. I know that there is settings where you can change the lighting, but I'm talking about base game lighting. If you put your, a lot of horror games will put their base game lighting at way too low so that everything's super dark. And that's because they want to create atmosphere. But what gets jumbled is that lighting and atmosphere are not the same, and lighting cannot make atmosphere at all. Because atmosphere is a combination of lighting and noise and location and uh building that location and um I don't want to say claustrophobia, but in a way, I guess that's the only way I could put it, where you create a space that is either out in the open or not. And I will talk about that when I get to atmosphere, but I want to talk strictly about lighting right now. I'm going to call it lightning about a bajillion times. Okay. Lighting. So there's definitely a reason why all horror games, or most horror games, put put a heavy emphasis on lighting. And that is because I think from the very beginning, even in older slasher films and older horror movies, lighting was a big part of when things would happen. Daylight would be like a safe kind of thing, right? Unless they wanted to throw in an ominous jump scare or something like that. Light and daytime would be the safe portion of the horror movie. And then when things shifted to night, that was when the spooky stuff happened. So it kind of created this not cliche, but rule about horror, where it was okay, daytime is safe time and nighttime is bad and evil. And that has persisted throughout the decades. But the problem is that just because you have somewhere that is dark does not mean that somewhere is scary. It requires a lot more than that. to become atmospheric. So there is a horror movie that I have not watched yet, I will say that, but that I've heard is set in the daytime, and the goal was, create a horror atmosphere in the light and kind of, subvert expectations. And I think that's a really good thing. I think if a horror game can take daytime and make it scary, that would be great. I think if horror movies leaned more into that, that would be great, because it's taking what was fundamental and it's twisting it into, okay, we're not safe anywhere. And that's a great thing to have, because even in horror games that are set in dark places or that have dark moments, the light is still a safe place. You have flashlights or torches or lanterns, and they're all deemed helpful. And so we associate this darkness with evil, and it's also because darkness leans a lot into the unknown, which is already a scary thing. Say you're walking around a house in complete light. You know that your peripheral vision is going to allow you to see everything within a room, mostly. And you know that there's nothing that can hide in pure light. Now take away that light and give your character a flashlight, and all you've got is what that flashlight is illuminating. Any dark corner could be somewhere where this monster could hide. And that's kind of why darkness is so abundant in horror games. The problem becomes when you have that darkness and you make it way too much. I know how annoying it is to play a horror game and not be able to find something, or to get lost somewhere, or to run around like crazy because you're missing one piece that could have been easily found if it wasn't super freaking dark. Darkness is a good thing. I think it is a great foundation. I think it has been, the foundation of darkness being scary has been laid down for generations, and we can't just get rid of that like that, because it would take a while for anyone to be afraid of light. I think that's a fine statement to make, but I just want to emphasize that making everything super dark does not create atmosphere. It will never create atmosphere. Atmosphere is a combination of things, and just making things super dark does not make things super scary. So ending statement for that bullet point, I guess, is just like, focus on creating an atmosphere that maybe doesn't rely on darkness, or focus on creating an atmosphere in darkness that isn't pitch freaking black. Don't make it too dark, don't make it too light, that kind of thing. You need a balance. Now, switching into atmosphere, because atmosphere does have lighting in it, don't get me wrong, to have good atmosphere, lighting must be a part of it. Atmosphere is also noise, world building, and world creation, along with lighting. So, lighting is a part of atmosphere. If you get the lighting correct in an atmosphere, it can be hugely impactful, because if you have everything else right and the lighting's off, it can be just iffy to some people. So let's take a forest, because that atmosphere is really, it's a lot, right? You can do a lot with forest. It can be daytime, it can be nighttime, it can be evening, sunset, whatever. A forest atmosphere, let's put it in dark, because why not? A forest atmosphere in the middle of the night still has light to it. Why? Because the moon's there. So it cannot be pitch black. Well, I mean, I suppose it could if the tree cover is thick enough, but there's still a sort of light to it. But the important part of a forest is the sound. You've got a billion bugs in that forest. You've got deer, squirrels, birds, cicadas, depending on where you are. The leaves on the ground, the sticks, the dirt even, and things can be in the forest because of, depending on your setting. Humanity often leaves traces wherever it goes, and in forests especially, I feel like there would be plastic bottles, glass bottles, pieces of metal, stuff like that, and, even cabins in the woods. That's a horror movie, Cabin in the Woods. Anyway, but that's what atmosphere truly is, right? To create a forest atmosphere, the sound must be there. The feeling of a forest must be there. The crunching of leaves, the moving of sticks, the sound of the crickets or the cicadas, or seeing something in the distance that could be the monster, but oh nope, it's a deer, oh it's a squirrel, something like that. And then add in that lighting with the moonlight and the darkness, and you have to have a flashlight and stuff like that. But also the world building. The forest can't be too empty, right? It has to have an abundance of trees. There might be a hiking trail with some gravel on it, or some paved dirt, or something like that. It might be near a highway, which would be the sound of cars, unless, you're out in the middle of nowhere in this forest, and then there would be very few cars. But the point is that atmosphere is very complex, and it requires a lot of thought put into it. The difference between the inside of a house in Layers of Fear, and the atmosphere of like a theme park in what's a theme park horror genre, Rambley's Big Adventure, whatever that one's called. There's no way that's the name of it. Or an industrial site like Five Nights at Freddy's, I guess, that had an industrial in sister location, technically, kind of, sort of. Or, a forest like in the Blair Witch Project, which I think there's a game about that, but I know it's a movie. There's a lot of specific differences and specific atmospheric changes that you need to make. The same atmosphere that you have for that forest that we created with the bugs and the deers and the whatever would not be the same as Layers of Fear giant mansion. You would have the creaking of floors, you would have maybe the echoes of the halls, or paintings falling down, or rain outside of windows. You would have if you wanted to, actually, the silence of a house can create noise. I will Silence speaks volumes is a very real statement, not only to, conversation, but in atmosphere as well. Speaking as someone who always has a fan on, I have that one, and I have an overhead fan on. The moment the power goes out and I can hear that silence, the house becomes completely changed. There is a weird feeling to not speak when there's so much silence. And that's another thing. With atmosphere, the change of volume or noise or sound within that atmosphere can be terrifying. Let's go back to the forest we've just created. If you were to be walking in that forest and you see something and it's a deer, but then you see something else and maybe it's a deer, but maybe it's something else, and then suddenly it moves and the entire forest goes silent. And then for a moment, while you're locking eyes with this thing, a cricket chirps and that sucker just like runs at you and vanishes or does something to that effect, it's the lack of noise being loud and then something breaking that silence that can be terrifying. Or just that lack of noise in general, which I believe I've talked a lot about, where you give a horror game noise and you take it away, it can be very eerie. But you have to know when to do that. So, conclusion to that bullet point, I guess, without, talking too much about it further, because I think atmosphere is like a really in-depth topic, and you could talk about atmosphere and like what it does forever. Like, actually, hold on, before I conclude this bullet point. So atmosphere is a huge thing, and I think that there is a horror game, and multiple horror games actually, that use different atmospheres in the same game very well. One of those being Resident Evil Village, which has multiple different atmospheres, and although I have not gotten the ability to play it, I have seen it, and I believe, to my memory, when I watched those, every atmosphere was well done. Now, I'm not gonna say that it's the scariest game, although again, have not played it, and playing something and watching something are vastly different. But there are definitely moments where I don't think it's so much scary as it is like combat. Regardless, I think it has multiple different atmospheres where it does very well in each. Take House Dimitrescu. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. That's going to be very, very, very different to the absolute Saw movie level basement of, and I've forgotten his name. You know who I'm talking about, her brother or whatever. And that's going to be vastly different to the dollhouse. It's all very, very different atmospheres, but they're all done relatively well. So I just wanted to throw that game out there because I think it does atmosphere well. Another one that does atmosphere well, I believe, and I haven't seen this game in a long time, is Outlast. The one set in the hospital. I think that atmosphere is well done. However, I think it has that problem with being way too dark for no reason in some of the sections. Again, if I'm remembering correctly, I have not seen that game in a long time. But to conclude the bullet point of atmosphere, there is a gentle balance with everything in horror, but atmosphere especially, because if you have really good atmosphere, it can make your monster, it can make your connections, it can make your world building look insane. Like, it is like the glue that holds everything together, because if you have good monsters, if you have good connection, if you have a good, and I'll talk about connection, I'm throwing that word around like I've explained it. Anyway, if you have good everything, but the atmosphere is lacking, then that game will not be good. There is one indie game that I played. There's been a ton of them, but one that I remember as I'm talking about this, Dead Sea. I think that atmosphere is well done. I think that it builds connection, it builds atmospheric pressure. I think it's well done. Anyway, atmosphere is extraordinarily important. I highly recommend that any developer of any horror game or any movie or whatever thinks extraordinarily hard on the atmosphere that you are trying to create. If it's in a house, try your best to put yourself in those situations. Go and look at other horror games, other horror movies that have done, house. Yes, that have done house atmosphere well. Try to incorporate all that makes a home a home. Even walk around your own house, change your own atmosphere or apartment or whatever. basement. I don't care. The point is, think long and hard about the atmosphere you want to create, because in the end, atmosphere is your glue, and if that glue is lacking, your entire game is going to fall apart. At least in my opinion. I think atmosphere is the most important. Um, so because I've been mentioning it so much with atmosphere and lighting, let's move to the bullet point of connection, because that's also a very important um piece of the puzzle. So when I say connection, I mean connection to a couple different things. First of all, connection to the player character, connection to the world, or connection to the game, which is a lot harder than you would think. Um, Connection to the player character is a very easy thing to establish. Connection to the story or the world building or whatever is also very easy to establish. But connection to a game is not. And it's the reason is because when I say connection to a game, that's connecting you as a person to the game. Now, this is, ARG games or games that refer to you as the player or games like that. When the game is trying to build a connection to you as a person, when you are trying to connect to the game, that is a very hard connection to make. Near impossible, in my opinion. Now, there's a reason for that, and it's because it's separating immersion. The immersion is you're supposed to be, a part of the game, and I just don't think that works really well, because in the end, people know that this is a game. And when you bring them out of that immersion and you start referring to them, unless you've been stalking each and every one of your players and you have incredible, important information on them, like personal information, the immersion is lost as soon as you start accusing them of things. And I bring this up because I have been watching a lot of Minecraft horror genre things by an amazing creator. And like one of the main things that I saw that was a problem is connection between, like with the ones that were ARG-ish related, connection between the player and the game. And when you want to build a story and you want to connect to the player, I think that is nearly impossible to do. Now, if I am to be proven wrong, that would be great and really cool and awesome. I think, but I doubt that's going to happen. Now, I think you can create a atmosphere. I think you can create a game. I'm not going to say atmosphere 1,000 times. I think you can create a game that makes the player look around the room or feel tense or, unsafe in their own space. I don't think that you can connect them into the game. I don't think that can happen very well. I think you can try. I think that it's worth trying. It's worth pushing the boundaries of, because it's not something that has been done well. It is worth attempting to do, right? But I think it is very difficult, and I don't think it's done properly quite yet. So I encourage to try. I encourage go forth and create a connection between the player and the game, but I don't think it's possible, to be honest. Which is sad, because I would love to be very spooked about, like, me. Like, I don't know. How do you phrase that? I don't know. Anyway, but moving on from that connection, there's also connection between the easiest connection to make. Let's go from the hardest to the easiest. Is between as to the player character, right? You can create a very easy connection to the player character, make somebody like care, but for some developers that's actually very difficult to do, because your character can be annoyingly uh connected or want to be connected in an annoying way. This happens, I think, a lot in movies, somewhat in games, where the character is way too relatable or way too quirky or way too cool or, way too traumatized. No, like all things, there is a balance. Do not be annoying. Do not push it. I think it gets really put on. Now I'm talking about movies. I think it gets really put toward women characters. I think that that is a shame. I'm not going to talk any further about that. Statement has been made. That's more about movies. But there is a game that does take a woman character and make her way too edgy and way too, like, care about me kind of thing. And that creates an unstable bond because you're connected to this character because you're playing the game, but you just really want them to shut up. And you really don't care if they die, and that is the problem. Right there. Pin it. If you care that the character dies, you have made a connection. If you do not care, no connection is made. None whatsoever. I think that this is a problem in the Fierce of Fathom series, where you have zero connection to these people, none at all, not even slightly. I think that there are moments where connection could have been made, or the connection is shaky, where, like, there's a creepy guy, and, a lot of people have dealt with creepy people. And so there's a loose connection there, but in the end, you really don't care if that person dies. And the Slenderman games, those are kind of old now. Anyway, in those games, there is no connection, that I know of, to the player character at all. None. Which means you don't care if this person dies. You are simply playing this game because it's horror. And although that's good for games like Slenderman, it's not always good for every horror game. You need a connection to the player character if you want to create a horror game with story. Base level sentence, that is the entire point of connection. If you want to create a horror game with story, underline, you have to have connection. If not, hey, flip connection. Who cares about connection? Buzz off, right? What was it called? It was a zoo game. Nobody liked it because it was, like, repetitive. What was it called? Zoophobia? No, that's not it. Zoocosis. That's it. There we go. Zoocosis created connection. As, iffy as that horror game is, and as repetitive as it is, Zoocosis created a connection to the player character. You were given this story where this guy is accepting this job because you need to provide for your family, and you steal to provide for that family, and he has morals, and you get to choose those morals and whether he breaks them or not, and that is a connection. BioShock does, and I'm talking about the one with the little girl and the cloud people. Cloud people. You know what? I'm just gonna go with that description. The cloud people and the little girl. BioShock creates connection. It also creates questions which connect to the world, and there we go. World connection, an also very easy thing to do. You just need to make the world interesting, which kind of collides with world building. But I'm gonna stick strictly to this. BioShock has other people in it besides the player character that you can connect to. The girl, for instance, although annoying at first, you can connect to. It also creates questions where she's being held. Why is she being held there? Why won't they let her out? What can she do? That is connecting the player to the world. If there is something unknown about the world that is interesting enough for the player to question, that is, and I know BioShock's not a horror game, by the way. That is creating that connection and creating questions about your player that aren't too, you know, crazy are also a way to build connection, but the easiest way is emotional connection. There is a Mario game, ARG kind of horror game. I do not remember the name. I'm probably not even going to be able to find the video that I watched on it. I might. I don't know. But there's a Mario horror game that creates connection very easily via emotional connection and mystery and intrigue with not only Mario himself and everyone around him, but the story that he's trapped in and the world itself and the entity. That horror does really well with connection, and it is one I will never forget. Even though I have never played it, that created emotional connection. That is one I will never forget. So, like everything in a horror game, there's a balance to it, but not really. It's just don't make your character annoying. I think Last of Us does emotional connection, heavy emotional connection. And there's one other. I think Half-Life Alyx, which is I'd say it's kind of a horror game. Also does emotional connection and connection to the world via questions. So, yeah, I think if you if we're looking for emotional connection, I would say The Last of Us. If we're looking for world connection, I would go more towards Half-Life for that. If we're looking for indie connection, indie games with connection, I would say the Mario game I mentioned, and I swear I mentioned one other that did connection well. I don't remember. Anyway, so world connection and player character connection are very easy to do. Player game connection, not so much. Not so much at all. I would, like I said, highly, like, I'm rooting for that, but I don't think it's ever gonna get good. So conclusion for that one is less of a balance than the other one. It's just create a character that someone can care about. And don't make it, don't try to force it, and don't try to create or hold on to a connection that's not there. Circling back to this Minecraft horror thing that I watched that immediately kind of made this a thing for horror games, you would do something and the story would continue, but it would give you almost nothing to go off of. So when it accused not only the player, but the character that the player was supposed to be, weird way to do that, by the way, of like this heinous act, you went, huh? Because there was no story given. That's forcing a connection that isn't there, and it's putting a persona on the player that the player is supposed to be without giving that story and forcing that connection. There are, I think, games that do that well, like Andy's Apple Farm, I believe, does that well, and that there is one more, isn't there? No, it is Andy's Apple Farm that I'm thinking of. That I think that does that well, where you are supposed to be somebody who did these vile acts, and it gives you a story to go off of. So it's creating, it's projecting a persona on the player that works because it's it's done well and it's given a story. Um, so it's less of a balance and more of a like, what do you want to do? How is it going to work? Focus on story and like how you're going to make this character likable or make the people care for it. Um, it less of a balance, more of like, what do you want to do with this character? Do you want people to care about it? Another one that did that well, oh my gosh, it was emotional connection. It's Still Wakes the Deep. That's the one. Does a really well done emotional connection, but I don't think it does its world building quite well, which is our next bullet point. So, world building. Not only the structure that you're putting your player in, but also the story regarding the world around the player and the oh my gosh, the player and its, I don't know, its personality, I guess. Um so when I say Still Wakes the Deep kind of let everyone down with its world building, I don't mean the story that surrounds the player, I mean its literal world building. How the world is built, how you encounter the really cool monsters, by the way. I really like the monsters in Still Wakes the Deep. I do not like the world building. Um, Again, preface that with I've never played the game. I've only watched people play the game. So, what I say comes from that and not like playing it. But I do not like the world building. I like the monsters. I like the story surrounding the player. Um, I think that world building is incredibly important, and I'm not speaking about the story aspect, I'm speaking about legit world building. It's incredibly important. Do not make, if mazes are a pain to horror because and I've played multiple horror games where there are mazes, if you are trapped in a location that you cannot get out of, no matter how many times you try, with an entity that is chasing you, it is not scary. It is scary one time. Once. Every other time after that, maybe twice, every other time after that is just, okay, how do I get out of here? Please stop annoying me. Unless done right, mazes are annoying. I think that Poppy Playtime does mazes or like that kind of structure horribly. Just putting that out there horribly. I think chapter 3 of Poppy Playtime is probably the best one. I think it did atmosphere and world building, both story and actual building of the world, really well, along with its monster, which looked astonishing and had its own story, which created connection to the monster, which is another part of connection I completely forgot about. Anyway, I think that chapter 3 is a good world building, and how do I don't know. How do I distinguish between world building as in story and world building as in building the world? I could say world building and building world. That's just gonna trip me up though. Anyway, I think it does both sections of world building correctly. I think Still Wakes the Deep does not, because its encounters with the monsters are very two-dimensional. It's very go here, do this, go here, stay here, go here, stay here, go here, avoid this guy, okay, you're done now. And that's just not how one should encounter a monster, because when given no freedom over where you're going, it takes the atmosphere and the monster and just throws it in the garbage because it doesn't matter. There's no freedom. But when given freedom, like, oh my gosh, why does of course that game pops into my head. Like with Granny, sure, we'll just throw that horror game in there. Um, the player is given ultimate freedom, whereas the monster is given pathfinding. So where you go is where you go, and where the monster goes is where the monster goes, and you have multiple chances to run into it. Now, I'm not saying that Granny is a super unique monster with all this cool stuff and like the pathfinding's insane and whatever. I'm saying that the freedom it gives you is better than the go here, wait here, avoid this guy, go here, do the same thing that Still Wakes the Deep has. To compare those two horror games is insane, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Um, so that's what I mean by world building as well. It's how you interact with the creatures, how the world is built around those creatures and around that atmosphere, and um how you modify that world building to your needs. Like in Layers of Fear, the world building is maze-like, but it's more interesting because of the rooms that you can go in. Now, I will admit that the rooms are kind of go into this room, see creepy thing, go out of this room, go into another room, see creepy thing, continue. But the creepy thing, kind of cool. And I do always appreciate some psychological horror because I think psychological horror is much more unique than just horror in general because it keeps the player waiting, and then when that scare happens, it's good or it's supposed to be good. Um, so world building, as in like building the world around you, is incredibly important. It goes hand in hand with atmosphere. What does not go hand in hand with atmosphere is monsters, though. But to conclude the world building, not the story, world building, the building of world, to conclude that, just make sure that your world is working hand in hand with atmosphere. That's what it needs to do. And allowing enough freedom so that you can encounter the amazing creation that is your monster without it subtracting from the experience. I will always love a freedom based interaction than a completely controlled interaction. Like, for instance, the interaction with the monsters in Bendy and the Ink Machine. The first interaction you have is a chase scene that is completely controlled by the developer, essentially. That is not as good as a freedom-based chase scene or freedom-based area in also Bendy and the Ink Machine with I believe it's the camera guy, where you are doing something for Alice Angel and you're in like an area, and that's more freedom-based. I like it. Also, I mean, shout out to Granny again, I guess. That one's definitely freedom-based. And a lot of other horror games have that too. I think Outlast has some freedom-based interactions as well that's not controlled completely by the developer. So just make sure that the world building is going hand in hand with the atmosphere, but still creating instances where your players are free to interact with the monster. Now, I'm not saying there cannot be scripted events. I think those are severely important for story building or world building, but not the building of the world. I think that those moments are incredibly important. I think that dialogue for like the Lady Dimitrescu sort of kind of cutscene where you're outside of her window, that's connection and story and important. The part where she, is speaking to you when you first get in the castle with her daughters is super important. I think scripted events are important. I just think that there should always be freedom built interactions with the monster. So, moving to monsters, which I think is our last thing to talk about, which is actually really cool because there's a lot with monsters. Monsters are one of the more important things in a horror game. I think horror games can go without them, I'm not gonna lie, but monsters are the overarching villain of any horror game, and they're incredibly important to the horror game and the atmosphere and the pretty much the world building and everything in general. Um, but monsters can come in very different forms, so it's very hard to say, like, okay, do this and do that, and you'll be perfect because monsters are very dynamic with how they work. There can be horror monsters like the one on the last train home, where it's very like almost deity like in its way of controlling things, but then it shows itself in a very quick portion, and it leaves you wondering what just happened. And it is a scripted thing, but it's done well. So um, I think that scripted one is pretty good. There's also monsters that have connection to them, like Poppy Playtime Chapter Three's main monster, the purple cat. I've forgotten its name and I don't care enough to look it up. The purple cat, it creates connection through stories of this underground daycare, and it creates connection through its death as well. But there is a line I must draw. If you are going to create an interesting connection to a monster that you want me to care about, do it well. Because if you give me two scenes of this thing, let's take a monster and say that it was like beaten as a child, and I get to see some of that, and I'm like, oh no, I have to kill this thing. And that's all you show me, I'm not gonna care when it comes down to it. I don't care. I do not care. But if you take the time and the effort to be like, okay, this is this thing's backstory, this is what happened. Let's like say that you're in a horror game and you stumble across this blighted village, and the main guy is like a big bulky mass of just moving flesh that is trying to violently scream and kill you. And we go through this village and slowly learn that this was a child, that's village was downwind of a uh chemical plant scientific experiment military thing, and they got this disease, and then uh, soldiers were sent in to wipe them out, and this kid watched his parents die, and the disease morphed him because he ran, and it grew inside of him, and in the forest he went through this transformation, and it caused him pain and agony, and broke his bones and whatever and what have you. And he came back to the village because his memory is gone, and he's looking for his parents, and he thinks you're a soldier. I'm gonna feel a lot worse about murdering him. But if that's not done well, then I'm not going to care. And creating connection to your monster when you want somebody to care about it is extremely important. If you don't, and you want to create an irredeemable, horrible thing, I am more for that, honestly. I really like irredeemable, terrible people, monsters, whatever. Um, but I think there are um there is more stock in creating a care for certain monsters. Just don't do it all the time. Um, Moving back to BioShock, there is a character in there, I think he's ex-military, that is a connection to, you know, that's a great connection that you can build where, I don't know, they're stuck in the war, or it's PTSD, or something like that, because that creates an emotional connection, and it even connects back to real stories in the world. So that's a great connection to make with a monster. But I'm always for irredeemable monsters. But you can still add story to somebody being irredeemable. Again, layers of fear. That man is terrible. At least in my opinion and what I know about him. He's just awful. And at the end, yeah, I mean, you feel worse for the wife than anything else, and that creates both the connection of irredeemability to the player who is the monster, and the monster who is, well, it's not irredeemable for her, it's emotional for her, the monster who is actually the victim. And I so the Layers of Fear does two different monster connections, and they both, I think that it's both done relatively well. So, connection to your monster is incredible, but it also matters visually what your monster looks like, right? You can't just have, like, Minecraft horror mods are not going to be as scary looking as Layers of Fear or Still Wakes the Deep or, heaven forbid, Five Nights at Freddy's. Those are, well, Five Nights at Junior's is probably a little more closer to whatever. Regardless, you need to find the genre and put thought into this creation, because I think even in Minecraft horror mods, that if the developers took a lot of time to think about what they wanted this monster to be, considered the genre and the atmosphere they wanted to create, and put time and effort into making a monster of that idea, I think they could be scary in their own right. But I think that, well, you know, monsters in different atmospheres, like Still Wakes the Deep or um, Resident Evil Village, will still be a little better because they're given that atmosphere where they can be highly detailed and stuff like that. But that's not saying that Minecraft horror can't be scary. I think ARGs are very terrifying, and I think a good pull from okay, this is the genre I want to create, this is the atmosphere I have, here's a monster for this that even has emotional and irredeemable connection to it, is the Walton Files. I think that story is done really well. I know it's not a game, but that is um a very good example of a monster that is stuck in a genre you wouldn't think is scary, but is, and it's an irredeemable and emotional connection to that monster. So, but yeah, monsters are conclusion time. Monsters are very important. It is very important that a lot of thought goes into the creation of that monster, and a lot of thought goes into, okay, what atmosphere is this thing going to be in? What do I want it to do? What story do I want it to tell? What connection do I want to make with this? And what questions does the player need to ask when it comes to this? Like Last Train Home, it spikes a lot of questions, but the monsters from Outlast spark a lot of questions, which it ties into the story of the whole game. And even the creations in Resident Evil Village, they still spark some kind of question, and that's important to the monsters of a horror game, I guess. Like, even, okay, we're bringing this back up, even Granny, at the first game, at least, when it came out, it sparked a bunch of questions, right? What is this? Where did the creator pull this from? Is it from a, urban legend, like somewhat like Slenderman? Or why are we in the house? What is she doing? Why is she like this? Stuff like that. I just think that connecting a monster to questions, story, remembering the atmosphere, and wondering what connection needs to be made with those monsters is extremely important. But regardless of my 5 bullet points of atmosphere, lighting, monsters, connection, world building, a horror game is whatever the developer wants to make it. It doesn't always have to rely on lighting. It doesn't always have to rely on a monster. It's not always going to be based off of super cool world building. It's not always going to have a freedom interaction with a monster. Some things are going to be scripted. Some horror stories are going to lean more towards the story than the horror because they want to tell a story with horror, not have a story in horror. And that is why it is so subjective when you look at a horror game to be like, yeah, this is good, because there are horror games and there is the horror genre, and then there are 1,000 different ways you can do horror. And each one of those ways is gonna have a different atmosphere, lighting, world building, monsters, and connections that need to be brought together to make a good horror game. But I think as far as generalizations go, I think I did pretty well. I think generalizing, basically balance your lighting, don't be too dark, don't do too light. Remember the atmosphere you want to create. The world building needs to go hand in hand with the atmosphere you want to make. The monster needs to have the atmosphere in mind when creating it, and the connections need to be made correctly if a story is what you're going for. So yeah, I think I have talked about this incredibly way too long, but it is a topic I really like and I really care about, and I am always one to invite conversation into what people's opinions are on a good horror game or anything in general, but in this instance horror games. And I always like talking about horror games or games in general, because every person can have a different experience with it and walk away with different thoughts, which is also another reason I like talking about movies. And there's also a lot of moving parts to it, so it's very interesting to talk about. But regardless, I'm going to stop yapping. Thank you for sitting down, thank you for watching, and thank you for hopefully enjoying as much as I did, and I will hopefully see you in the next one. What are your opinions?